Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast in partnership with NUE, that's NUE, where we explore real tools and stories for building mental strength in the modern world.
Dr. Judson Brewer is a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and professor at Brown University's School of Public Health and Medical School, where he serves as Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center. Over more than 2 decades at Yale, MIT, and Brown, he has pioneered the science of habit change and addiction, studying how the brain's reward-based learning system drives behaviors from smoking and anxiety to compulsive eating, and developing clinically proven approaches to change them.
His TED Talk, A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, is one of the most watched TED Talks of all time with over 20 million views. And his book, Unwinding Anxiety, became a New York Times bestseller. His work has been featured on 60 Minutes and Time Magazine and across the BBC and NPR. Today, he joins us to talk about the science of habits, how this applies to anxiety, food disorders, and more. For example, common misconception about anxiety is that it's something to manage. His argument is that it's something to unlearn. Welcome, Dr. Brewer.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. I think we kind of mentioned this before, but in preparation for having you on, we've read 2 of your books, Unwinding Anxiety and The Food Habit. I chose Food Habit for obvious reasons. And Luke read Unwinding Anxiety.
I mean, one of my favorite parts of your book, Unwinding Anxiety, Dr. Brewer, is just your vulnerability about how you went through medical school, residency. You were helping patients, clients and such, but then you were recognizing similar things in yourself in regards to anxiety until you eventually had some panic attacks yourself and such. So can you walk us just a little bit through your journey of how you got here and what you want to share there?
I'd be happy to. I didn't even know that I had pretty strong anxiety at the end of college. My body was letting me know. I'll spare everybody the details, but I talk a little bit about it at the beginning of Unwinding Anxiety. I developed irritable bowel syndrome, which is not a pleasant experience. I'll just put it that way. I kind of had to map out where all the bathrooms were on campus when I'd go for a run. And I went to the student health thinking I had some bacterial infection from backpacking and not filtering my water. It turned out not to be that. It turned out to be anxiety. And so, for me, that was a great lesson because I started to realize that anxiety could show up in a bunch of different forms. People can say that they're anxious, but often it's a shapeshifter. It'll show up in different ways for different people at different times. As another example, I started getting panic attacks in residency. This was after, about 8 years of graduate training. And, all the conditions came together from having to be in charge of patients, where, I was expected to know a bunch of stuff, even though I just graduated from medical school. Combine that with sleep deprivation and, all sorts of other things. And that certainly, I think, could lead to a lot of anxiety or panic for anybody. So, knowing the anxiety space myself, both in terms of what it felt like in an embodied way, but also getting these panic attacks was really helpful for me to both learn, okay, this is what it actually feels like. So, for example, I'd learned in my psychiatry residency that all these checklist symptoms and things around panic attacks. And then when I actually started getting them and started feeling like I was going to die, like literally those are the thoughts that came through my head. I was like, oh, wow, this is textbook, because I learned that. And I was like, really? And yes, it is true. I can say that from personal experience. So that all put me in a good space to be able to really explore this both clinically in helping my patients with anxiety, but also putting this to the test in my lab where we were, where I could see where current treatments were failing and also start to explore new ways to address anxiety and other habits.
Yeah, most people come to anxiety research through the lens of treatment, like medication, CBT, exposure therapy. You kind of came from a different angle. And how do you view treatment as it relates to medication and some other traditional approaches?
Well, I've certainly, prescribed medications for decades. And for some people, medications can be helpful. For example, with anxiety, there's this number, it's called number needed to treat, which gives us a sense for how well a general class of medications is going to work. For anxiety, it's 5.2, which means about 1 in 5 people are going to show a significant reduction in symptoms. And for the record, that's actually better than a lot of other medications. Like that number needed to treat is higher for things like cholesterol medications and things like that. But still, for me, it basically made it such that I was playing the medication lottery. So for every 5 patients that come in, I don't know which one of those 5 is going to benefit with medications, which one's going to win that genetic lottery, and then what to do with the other 4. So for me, prescribing medications was pretty straightforward, but having those medications help patients was less straightforward. And so that's where I started employing some of the research that I'd been doing in other realms. So for example, I'd done some research as early as my residency, looking at different ways to help people with addiction and to help them break other habits. And we developed programs for smoking and for eating. And with anxiety, I remember people in our eating program saying, hey, anxiety is triggering me to stress eat. Can you actually develop a program for anxiety? And at first I was like, well, I prescribe medications, but then put a bug in my ear and went back and looked at the literature. And it turns out that it was back in the 80s. There was a guy, Thomas Borkovic, who had suggested that anxiety could be driven through negative reinforcement, which is basically means that it could be a habit. I didn't learn that in medical school or residency, but it was probably the most important thing that I never learned, because when I went back and looked at that and developed a program for anxiety that was based on this, and then we did several randomized controlled trials. It's just kind of gold standard for seeing if something works. We got gangbuster results. Like we did a study with anxious physicians, got a 57% reduction in these clinically validated anxiety scores. We did a larger study, this was our first randomized controlled trial with people with generalized anxiety disorder. We got a 67% reduction in anxiety. And the usual treatment group, that was our control group, they had about a 14% reduction, which is right in par, about 1 in 5, right? It's online with what you would expect with usual treatment. So we're seeing the usual effects that people had found previously, and we're seeing gangbuster effects by approaching anxiety as a habit. And just to add one more statistic there, we got a 64% remission rate as compared to a 3% remission rate. This is at our primary endpoint at 2 months in the group that got our training. So, and then I won't go in, we can geek out if you want, but we worked out the mechanism. We actually just finished a 3-year neuroimaging study showing that the practices that we employed in those programs target specific brain networks. Like it's all coming together pretty nicely. But the coolest part is when my patients would say, I did 15 years of therapy and it didn't do anything, and I did your app and boom.
Oh, that's definitely rewarding.
I mean, those statistics are so powerful. The data's there, right? The habit loop. I mean, it's such a fundamental part of even just what you said and how anxiety could fit in that loop. Can you walk us through this, like, trigger, behavior, reward, in plain language? What's the brain actually doing here? I think when most people hear habit, they think of morning routines or nail biting. But how is anxiety a habit in the same way?
Let's start without any habit forms. So there are 3 elements. I think of these as necessary and likely sufficient. So a trigger, a behavior, and a result. And so if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, which I think can be helpful framing, so I'll just go through this quickly. Imagine our ancient ancestors that had to remember where food was, right? They didn't have refrigerators or DoorDash. They had to go find food and then, remember how to get back to it. So imagine they're foraging, they find some food, there's a trigger, they eat the food, there's the behavior, and the result literally is this dopamine surge that starts from their stomach signaling to their brain that there are calories here. And so we learn what's called a context dependent memory. We lay that down, and that's called positive reinforcement. So we learn to do things that are pleasant, or where the result or the reward from a neuroscience perspective is pleasant. The other side of that is called negative reinforcement. Same three elements, but imagine you're foraging, you see some predator that wants to have you for lunch. So your behavior is to run away, and the reward is that you don't get eaten, right? So avoiding something unpleasant, like being eaten, is called negative reinforcement. And this is where anxiety comes in. So Thomas Borkovic, it's funny, he suggested this in a very humble 2-page paper in the mid-'80s, right when Prozac came out. And everybody's like, yeah, whatever, Prozac, it's going to heal all of our ails. So unfortunately, that did not turn out to be a happy ending. Again, I'm not saying medications are not helpful. 1 in 5 people, certainly helpful. So what Borkovic suggested was that the feeling of anxiety can trigger the mental behavior of worrying, and that makes us feel like we're in control, or at least doing something. So my patients, when we start exploring this as a habit, I ask them, well, what do you get from worrying? They say, well, it feels better than doing nothing. And sometimes they falsely associate it with problem solving. And I say falsely associate because if somebody's worrying all day and they solve a problem, they think, oh, maybe my worrying solved the problem. This is the fallacy of correlation that does not equal causation, right? So, if you're worrying all day, you're likely to correlate the two because it's happening at the same time, So does not mean that worrying leads to problem solving. In fact, there's plenty of evidence showing that the opposite is true. The more we worry, the worse we do at solving problems.
Yeah, but there's something when we are doing that reduces anxiety. If we're worried about something, if we start doing something to address it, then we feel better. And I guess what you're saying is that the anxiety habit loop, the worrying itself can trick the brain into the work that we're doing, but it's not. Worrying doesn't do anything positive.
Absolutely. I was just talking. I was working with a patient this morning who described it as performative. So, like, she would distract herself from her anxiety by just doing more stuff. And she described it as performative because it wasn't actually solving the anxiety. It was just distracting her and helping her avoid that anxiety temporarily. So that's absolutely the truth. It doesn't solve the anxiety. It just kicks the can down the road for a little while.
Yeah. And we're talking about anxiety here, but there was one thing you mentioned in the book, Hunger Habit, that intrigued me. And I just wanted to ask you, you wrote that people were not eating. One of the big realizations you had in your research was people were not eating because they were hungry, but they were eating whenever they had an urge. But then you just made this sort of parenthetical comment that I just wanted to ask you about. You said that realization led you to change the way you even treat anxiety and depression. But then you didn't go into that because it was the Hunger book. And I'm like, what did you mean by that? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, I think the parallel there is, and just the backstory I was working with a group of individuals in my clinic. We had this group medical visit with binge eating disorder. So anybody could join who had binge eating disorder. And it took me about a month to realize that I was missing something. And what I was missing was that I assumed that they could tell when they were actually hungry. This is called homeostatic hunger, meaning when we're out of balance because we need calories, our stomach tends to signal, hey, go eat some food. And I assumed they could tell the difference between that and stress eating, but they couldn't. One person spoke up and said, well, I have an urge and I eat. And then everybody was nodding their head and they're like, yeah, that's me too. And so there was a new term that was developed in research called hedonic hunger, meaning we're eating not because we're actually hungry, but out of emotions, right? And so we're stress eating, and we're eating when we're bored, we're eating when we're sad or lonely or whatever. And so the parallel there with anxiety was that people can't even tell that, that worrying, the worrying's like hedonic hunger. The worrying's not actually solving the problem, just like eating when we're not hungry isn't solving a time when we're hungry because we're not actually calorically deficient at that time. So that's the parallel there. And also a lot of the brain networks are similar as well, it turns out. So that was the big aha for me, was like these all line up pretty nicely when you look at the underlying mechanism related to how any habit is formed.
Yeah, fascinating.
One of the interesting things, I had so many aha moments in reading Unwinding Anxiety. One of them is, breaking habits, or a lot of what's popularized in society today around breaking habits. The way you position it seemed almost counterproductive. For instance, like replacing a bad habit with a good habit. You're still in the loop. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So, and I was taught this in residency as well. I actually went to it. It's not like I went to some schlumpy residency program where they're just teaching me crap. This is kind of the best stuff out there, right? So we're getting the best training, and that training is out of date. So it's not actually up to date with current neuroscience. And so let's take the substitution strategies, right? So smoking, that's the most common one. And so what I was taught in residency was that, if somebody has an urge to smoke, encourage them to take a walk, eat some candy, do something instead of smoking. So they replace the less healthy habit with a healthier habit. Now, eating candy when you're stressed is not exactly the healthiest habit. And it's just, it's just that replacement strategy where it's like that underlying mechanism is still in place, where people don't actually know how to work with the urges to do the thing. And that's problematic not only if you want to have good dentition, right? If you're eating candy all the time is not such a healthy thing. But the other piece to that relates to the underlying mechanism. If we don't know how to actually work with that core craving itself, then we're not going to be able to break free from the habits. And if we don't have whatever that replacement thing is handy, we're going to fall back to the old thing. I've seen this a lot with patients, for example, who substitute exercise for, drug use, cocaine, methamphetamine, often it's stimulants, but it could be anything. So, when they don't have access, let's say they get hurt because they've over-exercised, right? They have a overuse injury. Then their body says, well, now you can't do this. Let's go back to the old thing. So the critical piece here is learning how to really undermine the process itself.
Is habit replacing still an effective temporary tool, or do you feel that it's actually harmful because it appears to solve the problem, so it actually masks it?
Yeah, great question. I would say it's better than it's a good temporary tool. I think of it as a Band-Aid, right? Better to put a Band-Aid or a bandage on the cut to help it stop bleeding, but at the core, you've got to really clean out the wound so it heals by itself.
First, I want to just comment on in your talks and in your book, I really love and appreciate the sort of compassionate tone, the forgiving tone, and that we don't need to shame ourselves, and I think that approach is really effective. And one of the things that you talk a lot about is willpower and discipline, and it's not about that as much as really understanding the underlying issue. But for many, that's sort of a controversial idea, because it's like, pull up your bootstraps and be tough. And so maybe you could just briefly explain that concept. But then the question I have as a follow-up is there any place for willpower and discipline? Isn't there still times when the only way you don't fall back into a habit is just to be strong, or am I still thinking in the old mindset?
Yeah. Well, let's start with some of the problems with willpower. So it's a great business model if you want to sell people stuff that they have to keep coming back to. So look at any weight loss program where they say the formula is correct. You just it's your fault that you can't follow it. So, it gets people to come back and keep trying stuff over and over and over. And it also puts people in the mindset that there's something wrong with them. They don't have enough willpower, or there were these studies for a number of years where they were studying what's called ego depletion. You can think of it as like willpower depletion, where people feel like they have willpower early in the day and then later it gets depleted. There were large studies where you kind of collect all the studies together called a meta-analyses, and they found that about half the studies found positive results and about half found negative results, meaning that this was chance, meaning that this wasn't a true thing. And so, that research, while it took a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of money, probably is showing a null finding, meaning that, ego depletion is not a thing. And people have gone into details suggesting why that's not the case. Why ego depletion is not a thing at all. It just, kind of sounds good because people can feel like, oh yeah, that's me. It's easier to resist a cookie early in the day and not resist one at night. Well, generally, we're not eating cookies for breakfast, so it's kind of a false thing to start with. So the ego depletion thing, or the willpower, depletion thing, puts people in this vulnerable place where they feel like there's something wrong with them and they need, other people are better endowed to be able to resist. If you look at it from a neuroscience perspective, and I think this gets at the second part of your question, are you ready for this? There's actually no neuroscience evidence for willpower. So when you talk, whether it's a mouse behavior neuroscientist, whether it's somebody looking at non-human primates, or whether it's somebody studying humans, the formulae for habit change, for changing habits, doesn't even include an equation or a variable in the equations for willpower. It's not even there. And you can, even without it, it's not like they're lacking, you can actually predict quite a bit in terms of how quickly animals will form habits and also how quickly they'll break habits based on the formulae. And the formulas are not brand new. Like my lab still uses derivatives of some of these formulas from Rescorla and Wagner. They developed their first reinforcement learning paradigms back in mechanistic formulas back in the 70s. So it's not like this is new stuff. It's just that it's hard for people to stomach that there may not be much of a thing called willpower. Humans don't like to hear that.
No, you're right, though. I've brought up this idea to people, and they're like, well, that can't be right. I know people have said there's a ton of science behind it, right? But what you're saying is that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I would encourage anyone that thinks there is a ton of science behind willpower to go actually look up the science, and I'd be happy to, they can send it to me because I've followed this literature carefully.
Yeah, putting it in context, like the Stanford marshmallow study, for example, the longitudinal study of kids that showed that their ability to defer the marshmallow was a really strong prediction of other success metrics later in life.
Yeah. That turned out to be a study that was done on Stanford faculty's kids. So it turns out that socioeconomic status was a good predictor of their outcomes because they all had high socioeconomic status. Like Palo Alto was and still is a pretty expensive place to live, and people that live there have high socioeconomic status. So there have been people that have debunked that or haven't been able to replicate those studies. And when they've gone and chased down the mechanism, it turns out that, and it's not surprising that, people with higher socioeconomic status tend to do better later in life.
Walk us through it. Maybe willpower, but desire. At some point, someone has to desire to change a habit enough to pick up your book and read it. I mean, someone has to have a desire before anything happens. That precedes all action. So how does that play into the...
So let's take an extreme version of that. My patients with an addiction, there's often this saying, when you hit rock bottom, you're more likely to change. a behavior. Now, we don't all have to hit rock bottom of whatever we're doing before we're going to change, but it highlights how the mechanism works. And the idea is that, well, let's just go through how any habit forms, and then this will get at that. So we form a habit based on how rewarding a behavior is, right? So, for example, if I eat some broccoli versus some chocolate, right? From a caloric density perspective, most people's brains are going to prefer things like chocolate or ice cream or cake because they have a higher caloric density than broccoli. So our brains set up these reward hierarchies based on how rewarding a certain behavior is. Let's use a concrete example of chocolate. So for me, I have a pretty clear reward hierarchy. Like, I like chocolate that's higher than 70% cacao content because I don't get the sugar rush and the craving for more as much, and it actually has a good taste to it. Then you add in some cayenne and some sea salt, and you can imagine how there are these different, and then the different brands of chocolates, right? Some have a better mouthfeel, some have, there's all this stuff. And so my brain has this whole reward hierarchy around chocolate. Like, I'm going to compare Lindt to this, to that. And then if given a choice, this is actually set up to help us make decisions quickly. So given a choice, I don't have to go eat all of those every single time to make a decision. It's like, oh yeah, I already know which one I prefer. And this is actually set up in the part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex. So think of that as set and forget. So you set a reward value for a certain behavior, and then you forget about the details. And that's important because it helps us make decisions quickly, and we don't have to recall all of that stuff later on. And that's important because with habits, by definition, we're doing something automatically. So I'm going to basically automatically pick a certain type of chocolate over another because I've eaten that one enough to know I prefer that one, right? So I'm not going to recall every single time I ate it. I'm just going to be like, yeah, that's the one I want. Now, so that's how we set habits. So the only way to break a habit is to actually bring that reward value back online. I'll give you a concrete example from a study that my lab did. So we brought in people who had overeaten for decades, okay? And we had them pay attention when they overate. And it turns out that within 5 to 15 times of them paying attention when they overeat, that reward value goes below zero. So all they had to do was bring this awareness online and link up behavior with how rewarding that behavior was. And they got what in science terms is called a negative prediction error. And that's just a fancy pants term for saying, okay, they were expecting it to be at some level of reward, and it was less than expected. So there's the negative prediction error. They were predicting that it would be such a reward, and it was less than predicted. And that actually causes dopamine firing and learning, where we actually reshuffle that reward hierarchy to the point where we learn, in this study, they learned pretty quickly, overeating does not feel good. Okay. That's critical because that helped them start to shift that behavior pretty quickly. So even though they'd overeaten for decades, within 5 to 15 times, they were already starting to shift that behavior. Does that make sense?
It does. And I love when you're walking through the 21-day program in your hunger habit book. I was reading it, it was sort of this realization that the first third or the first section has nothing to do with changing behavior. I mean, well, it leads to changing behavior, but all it was noticing, observing, reflecting, knowing what your, food habits are, identifying like the loops that make you eat. And it's just about increasing your self-awareness. And that by itself, I mean, I was even noticing this weekend because I'm on like day 5 of your 21-day program. And I was even just noticing like just being aware, like, do I actually enjoy eating this? Does it actually taste good, or is it a habit? And there was things I was eating, I was like, this isn't even good, which you call out in the book, but it's true.
Yeah. Not to spoil it for you, but for me, that realization came through gummy worms, where I was totally addicted
you mentioned
to
that in the book.
gummy worms. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you're like, wait, they don't actually taste good.
Yeah, they don't. And it's easy. People can shove gummy worms in my face. And I'm like, ugh, get that nasty thing out of here. Whereas before I'd be like, give me some more.
Yeah. Interesting.
But it's because you've updated your brain's reward value to that, right? So what,
Totally.
the bicycle gears concept, for whatever reason, was such a giant aha moment for me. It's like, wow, it scratched some itch in my brain. Maybe it was that curiosity. I'm at the peak of the Goldilocks bell you're talking about in your book, just in this topic specifically. But can you walk people through the bicycle gears concept, gear 1, 2, 3, and then I have a lot of other thoughts on it, but I want you to walk through it for the listeners.
Yeah, this is a perfect time. So I think what we were talking about in terms of reward value fits perfectly here. So with that underlying mechanism in place, right? So if we know how our brains form habits, what we looked at over the last, we had done research on this for about 10 years before we went back and did a bunch of focus group research where we could collect qualitative feedback from people who are going through the programs and ask them, like, how would they actually put what they were learning into words? And it turns out from all those interviews that we could break this down into 3 steps, or because I like to ride a bicycle, and actually the analogy works pretty well. So the analogy is that, there are 3 gears, and you might be driving in any one gear at any one time. It's not like this is a linear process and you never go backwards. Just like, if you're riding up a hill, it's helpful to be in first gear. If you're going down a hill, you can shift to a higher gear so that you can get some momentum going. And so the 3 gears works pretty well, and is all based on awareness, right? Nothing having to do with willpower at all, which fits pretty nicely with the science and what we've been talking about earlier. So the first gear is just becoming aware of the habit. And at first, years ago, we were having people map out all 3 elements. So what's the trigger? What's the behavior? What's the result? Now, what we're finding, and actually we have a new program called Going Beyond Anxiety, where it's kind of an update of all of this. So I'll give you the updated stuff that's even, not even written about in Unwinding Anxiety, because we've even made slight tweaks since then to make it easier. Next year, I have a book called Going Beyond Anxiety, which lines up with our Going Beyond Anxiety program. But the idea here is we can very quickly identify what the behavior is. And often people get stuck at the trigger, like the why, because they're trying to find, I don't know if it was therapy or whatever, but they're like, I've got to figure out why this is happening. You know what? From a neuroscience perspective, the why doesn't matter because it just sets the loop in motion. It's not what actually changes behavior. So we can actually simplify that first gear to recognizing what the behavior is. Like, so what am I doing? Am I stress eating? Am I worrying? Am I procrastinating? Am I doom scrolling? Whatever it is, right? So we identify the behavior. So we can simplify that first gear to that. And why is this important? Because if we don't know that we're doing the thing, we're just going to keep doing it automatically. That's what a habit is by definition. Okay. Does that make sense before we go into the second gear?
Yeah. And that was a big idea. You touch on that in the hunger habit as well, but that, like, we don't need to get into childhood trauma to understand all the whys to change behavior. That's a key point.
I also like the simplicity of identifying the behavior versus mapping your own habit loop. I think mapping your own habit loop is a little more complex to figure out on your own. I love that.
Yeah, and I'll just also mention with the triggers, a lot of my patients say, well, there are a million triggers. Which one should I focus on? And I say, none of them. Just know that you're triggered. What's the behavior? Right? It simplifies things quite a bit, like you were saying, Luke. So the second gear we've actually touched on already. This is really where we leverage this reinforcement learning process. And so, just to really simplify it, the idea is to bring awareness online. So get really curious and ask one question, which is, what am I getting from this? And what that question does, or some version of that, right? That's not like the magic question and the only way to ask it. But the idea behind that is that we've got to bring awareness back online so that we can see exactly how rewarding the behavior is right now. Let's use worrying as an example. So people assume that worrying is helpful because they just do it all the time. Well, I say throw that assumption out the window and ask the question, what am I getting from this? So, and the important thing is to really start with the embodied experience, because that embodied experience is what drives future behavior. If something's rewarding and feels rewarding, our body's going to let us know. If it's not rewarding, our body's also going to let us know. So when I ask my patients to explore that question, what am I getting from this? And I did this just this morning with this patient again. What does the worrying and the avoidance get her? She was highlighting that it actually got her nothing. It was exhausting, and it just drove that anxiety cycle more. And so it didn't solve the problem and actually made her more anxious, which is pretty normal. So people would start to realize, and they wake up. And I think the most common answer I get with anxiety is, what do I get from this? Nothing. And they look at me like what am I missing? And I say, you're not missing anything. You set it up as a habit a long time ago, and your brain just assumes that it's helpful, that it must be rewarding. But just because something's a habit doesn't mean that it's rewarding. It might have been rewarding at some point, but it's not now. And that's that key distinction where people can start to become disenchanted with the behavior. That's what we talked about earlier with that negative prediction error. So they expect worrying, for example, to be rewarding. They see that it's not rewarding. And, this isn't magic. I have a t-shirt that says science, like magic, but real, right? So this is the real thing. When they feel into their body and they see that worrying is just making them more anxious, they're less excited to worry in the future. Same is true with overeating, right? When they pay attention when they overeat or stress eat and see that it doesn't solve the stress and actually gives them a gut bomb, not as excited to do that in the future.
All right, this show is all about mental fitness, and here's something most of us don't admit. Everyone has those moments when you feel overwhelmed, stuck, or unsure, and what's actually going on in your head. That's why we built New. New is a mental fitness platform designed to help you clear your thoughts, reflect, notice patterns, develop habits, and get support that fits who you are. It remembers your goals, your wins, the things you're working on, and helps you stay on track. Not therapy, not toxic positivity, just real support when you need it. Head to talkwithnew.com. That's talkwithnue.com. It's interesting. Early in my career, 25 years ago, I was doing a lot of machine learning. I was a software engineer, and I was building reinforcement models in the machine learning sense. And so when I read this in your book, it just made a lot of sense, because you have when you're writing an algorithm to explore a maze or something, and you get to the reward, then you back propagate that reward to all the steps to reinforce that was the right path. And when you hit a dead end, then you back propagate a negative reward to all those paths, and you do that enough times, and then you learn what the right path is. And so just having implemented the machine learning algorithm helped me understand this better, that what your self-awareness is just saying, oh, this is not even a helpful thing. And just that recognition, just in your mind, automatically back propagates that the behaviors that led to this aren't good either. I thought that was just fascinating for me.
Yeah. Well, guess where the computer scientists learned reinforcement learning from?
Where?
Well, it's from the psychology and the behaviorists.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So they saw that these neural networks are so efficient for animal learning, right? This is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So, in the early days of machine learning, from what I understand, and you probably know this better than I do, but they're like, hey, that works for human learning and for animal learning. Why don't we actually use it for machine learning? And lo and behold, it works pretty well. So I think of it as like, that's the OG of reinforcement learning. Is not what we're talking about in terms of modern day computer science. It's that the computer scientists have learned that it works so well that they've implemented it, and it really has turbocharged everything from machine learning to LLM development.
Yeah, it's the same with neural networks, which is a big step towards the large language models. And it's basically just trying to mimic the way that the brain works.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm glad you see that parallel. It's fascinating how these neural networks have now been implemented in computer science and work really well for that.
we've talked about gear 1, identifying behavior, gear 2, updating the brain's reward value. Just to go a little bit deeper on gear 2, because self-awareness is kind of a, generalized concept. Mindfulness, and actually the thing that really stood out to me is when you talked about intellectually understanding something is not enough, because the OCF, and maybe we can get into this, that part of your brain changes and updates the brain's reward value through like a felt experience. It's much different than just thinking through something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you're highlighting this, because often people fail because they think, their brain is is the ultimate arbiter. Well, if thinking really worked, my clinic would look very different. I could just tell my patients to stop overeating and stop worrying, and it'd be a single visit, and they would be happy and I would be happy because they would be cured. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. It's really that our feeling body is much stronger than our thinking brain. And so the key here is really feeling into the results of the behaviors, right? And so when we feel into how we get more anxious from worrying, then that actually makes us disenchanted and updates that reward value in the orbitofrontal cortex. So that's a critical piece where we really have to be totally embodied as we're asking, what am I getting from this? It's not some intellectual exercise. It's an embodied experience where we become disenchanted. So we get the gut bomb when we overeat. We feel more anxious when we worry. That's what drives behavior change, because we feel that these things don't feel very good. And that's where we're actually leveraging reinforcement learning, because we're getting that negative prediction error and seeing, oh, this is not rewarding. So we're actually using that negative reinforcement for behavior change in a good way.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So that's gears 1 and 2 anyways. I know, I don't know if going beyond anxiety, gear 3 is the same, the BBO, or...
It is. Yeah. So why don't we jump into that, which actually leverages the same mechanism. So, if we look at this and we become disenchanted with old behaviors through asking, what am I getting from this? That second gear, we can leverage the same process to find something better. And so I call this, finding the bigger, better offer. So if our brain says, well, overeating is not as great as I thought, worrying's not as great as I thought, what's better? And the key here is, we've talked about substitution strategies. The best thing is stepping out of an old habit loop in itself, right? And so I think of the simplest, bigger, better offer is just not doing the thing. So if something's not rewarding and we don't do the thing that's not rewarding, it feels better because we're not doing something that feels bad. So not overeating feels better than overeating. Not worrying feels better than worrying. Okay, does that make sense? And we can leverage something that we all have. This is where I think of kindness and curiosity as superpowers. So if we have a habit of worrying, we can get curious and we can flip that, oh no, that comes with worrying to, oh, what does this feel like in my body? And so instead of running away from those unpleasant sensations, we run toward them. And we start to see, oh, these are not actually as scary or as bad as I thought. Again, back to my patient from this morning, she was modeling this whole thing, where she started to realize that she had this habit of avoiding these unpleasant sensations for years. And so we could, she's been training to turn toward those, this phrase, the only way out is through. So we brought that up again this morning. And the idea is if you run toward your experience and you see what it really is, you can see if there's actually anything to be scared of. Something that's unpleasant doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be scary or that we need to be afraid of it. It's just unpleasant. And so we develop, and I use this a lot in our new Going Beyond Anxiety program, we're developing distress tolerance, right? We're learning to be able to be with unpleasant things, which is a critical life skill. I mean, I don't get me started on how much I see people doing the opposite in modern day, where we're learning all these things of soothing ourselves. Cornel West called our phones weapons of mass distraction, because we're learning to just avoid our experience. And then parents are modeling that to their kids and they're wondering why their kids are so anxious. Well, not to, I think it's helpful for people to wake up and see how they're dealing with distress. So we can learn that unpleasant doesn't actually need to equal bad. It can just equal unpleasant. When we're working out, for example, if you go to the gym and you lift weights, or my lab runs hills together, on a hill workout, it's unpleasant, but it's a good burn. Man, it's a good burn, especially after it's over. You've accomplished something, you feel good, you get in better shape. And that's what this third gear is all about, is learning to leverage curiosity to lean into the unpleasant experiences and leverage that, instead of falling into the, oh no.
The stress tolerance piece is interesting as well, because, throughout the book, you reference Carol Dweck's work, growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And towards the end, you talk about that model of, you have your comfort zone, you have your growth zone, and you have the panic zone, right? So like that growth zone can expand, your stress tolerance can expand, that inner capacity as an individual can be expanded. So
yeah, and that's a critical life skill, whether somebody's going through school or in a job. Imagine, what boss wouldn't want to hire somebody that's got good distress tolerance?
Exactly. And that's a huge part of the mental fitness podcast. Essentially, we define mental fitness as, hey, what are, in connection to yourself, connection with others, things like working out, health and vitality, sleep, what can you do to expand this container and your inner capacity as an individual to where you can get back up when life knocks you back down quicker, right? So
absolutely.
We think that's fundamental as well. Well, we could talk for a long time. Dave, do you have any parting thoughts? I wish we could stay on with you for hours. I have so many questions, but Dave, do you have anything?
Yeah, no, I thought that the gear concept was awesome. I wanted to just switch. We love the Mental Fitness podcast is all about practical application and talking about where people typically get stuck. And, what's the most common mistake people make when they try to apply mindfulness to anxiety? Where does it fall apart? What's the most common pitfall?
Probably that they think that they'd use a Western mindset of willpower. And I can say I fell prey to this for 10 years when I was first learning mindfulness, that it's kind of something that we have to do, like I have to pay attention to my breath, for example. I my first 7-day silent meditation retreat, I found myself crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager because I was thinking, like, I can get into medical school, but I can't pay attention to my breath. So I would say that is one of the key pieces, that it's not about, it's not about force or grit or willpower. It's really about curiosity and kindness, I would say, being kind to ourselves along the way.
And is there a version of this that backfires, like when we're super curious about discomfort and what's happening, where we can actually kind of, ruminate on that, or is that something you don't see too often?
I have not seen curiosity itself backfire. And to be clear, there are two types of curiosity. So the type of curiosity I'm talking about is called interest curiosity, the type where we're just curious about what's happening, as compared to deprivation curiosities when we're deprived of information. That's more of an intellectual information gathering pursuit. Not that deprivation curiosity isn't helpful for survival, it is, but the type of curiosity that we leverage in our Going Beyond Anxiety program, for example, is that interest curiosity. So really being interested in leaning into our experience. We're going to naturally titrate our distress tolerance as we build it. And so I haven't found any limit to really being curious, to bringing that interest curiosity into our experience, because, when we're interested, we'll know, kind of how much is enough for now and when to back off and lean back in again. So rumination, as you were highlighting, rumination, where we kind of get stuck in, the rumination tends to be about the past, and like worry tends to be about the future. Both of those are related to not being in the present moment, whereas interest curiosity is really about being present and curious about what's happening right now. And that seems to be, a good way to go no matter what.
Yeah, I love that.
Maybe the last question, I was thinking about this earlier today. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Brewer, is what does this look like for someone who considers himself not a mindfulness person? I know it's a weird question, but mindfulness, as you know, it's an experienced understanding almost. It's hard to tell someone about it, but experiencing is much easier to understand it, if that makes sense.
It does. And I've actually moved away from the word mindfulness because it's a concept and more toward the experiential elements. And so if you really look at the core underlying pieces, it's really about being curious. And so, if somebody's like, I'm not a mindful person or not a mindfulness person or that stuff, is rainbows and unicorns, that's fine. I would say that everybody has the natural capacity to be curious. And from there, we can just start to learn how powerful it is. And somebody, I've had people say, well, what do I do when I'm not feeling curious? And I say, well, get curious about what that feels like not to feel curious, because we can even leverage that moment to awaken curiosity.
That makes so much sense. I love that update there.
I love that too. And I just like that framing of rumination is about the past, anxiety or worry is about the future. But this is being curious and present in the moment.
Present, yeah.
So, final thought. If someone's listening to this right now who's tried everything for their anxiety except reading your book and applying its concepts, but if they still feel stuck, what's one thing after they order your book? What's one thing that they could start this week or today?
Well, I'd say what they could start today is just getting curious, and starting, I would say start with first gear because anybody can do that. In fact, we even have a habit mapper, a free habit mapper on my website, on the Dr. Judd website that anybody can download and start mapping this stuff out. So the idea is just start to recognize when you're stuck in a habit loop and what that habit loop is. Is it stress eating? Is it worrying? Is it procrastinating? Is it doom scrolling? Anybody can do that. And they can certainly use a habit mapper to help them map out the process, but that's something that anybody can start with. And then I would say, because that's relatively straightforward, they could then even start to shift into second gear and ask, what am I getting from this? So I would say that 1, 2 is something that very few people don't, you don't need to read a book to be able to start implementing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I see that your habit mapper. We'll link that in the show notes. We'll link both your books we referenced today as well. Dr. Brewer, thanks so much for coming on. Thank you for your important work you do, and we appreciate you coming on the Mental Fitness Podcast.
My pleasure.